Hello guys, welcome back to LR Anime. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of Soul Land 2 episode number 93 based on novel. So let's start. Wang Chua naturally stayed with him. She followed him beside his all-terrain self-driving fort and said, "Are you going to use this toy to barge through the miasma? That's entirely impossible. The toxic fog inside is too dense, and you can't even determine the right direction to go. Even if you can do so, you'll still need to breathe when you go inside. There won't be much for us to breathe in the depths of the miasma, so what are you going to do? When that happens, will you even be able to escape? Furthermore, I am confident that certain toxic miasmas are extremely corrosive, so metal will gradually become dysfunctional, and could even melt. You think this thing of yours can fend off all the miasma? Stop dreaming." Hua Yuhao made no reply as he continued working on his all-terrain self-driving fort. It was just as Wang Chua had said, he was attempting to make the self-driving fort more airtight. Hua Yuhao was very familiar with this soul tool. The Starlight Sapphire Ring's immense space meant he could bring along a lot of materials, so he took less than an hour to complete the adjustments to make the all-terrain self-driving fort more airtight. Hua Yuhao went inside to try it out, using spiritual detection to scan every single detail and component. He made sure that the internal regions were completely airtight before he came out, and began to work on something else on the outside. From Wang Chua's perspective, Hua Yuhao was incessantly stripping things off the self-driving fort before he added something else in their place in a manner that seemed overly complicated. Another 2 hours passed before he finished refining his all-terrain self-driving fort, and the sky was started to turn dark. He began to retrieve soul tool after soul tool from his Starlight Sapphire storage ring, and laid them all out neatly on the ground. He took out 16 milk bottles, and some stationary soul cannon shells. These shells were marked with various patterns and markings, 46 of them altogether. Hua Yuhao picked out 9 shells that had red markings and put the other shells away before he took out another normal storage type ring and put it on his right hand's middle finger. He placed those 9 shells inside this ring. It was clear that he was sorting his inventory and his equipment. He checked his 16 milk bottles and discovered that some of them weren't stored to the brim with soul power, so he immediately began to infuse soul power into these half-full milk bottles, eventually completely filling every single one. Every single milk bottle would be imperative to the subsequent operation, and every single Class 6 milk bottle could completely restore his soul power over a period of time. Wang Chua looked on as Hua Yuhao completed his tasks seriously, and her expression changed continuously. There was only one thought in her mind. She was still throwing around the statement that Hua Yuhao had just said to her before this. "I've thought about losing her and what would become of me, and I realized that my entire world would turn grey, and I would no longer have any vitality. Perhaps, I might even lose the will to live." That was when I realized to my surprise that her life has become more important than my own. She was so important in his heart, and he would risk his own life to break through this miasmic world for her. A person could actually give so much for another person. Why? How is that possible? She silently watched Hua Yuhao finish everything he was doing as she immersed herself within these complicated emotions. The sky had already turned dark when he finished up with his milk bottles. Hua Yuhao only made some time to rest at this moment. He raised his head and glanced at Wang Chua before he heaved a faint sigh and said, "Why haven't you left?" Wang Chua grunted coldly and replied, "Why should I leave? I want to see how a fool is going to kill himself." Hua Yuhao smiled when he heard fool, as the images of Wang Donga and himself on the sea god's lake surfaced in his mind. "I'm not a fool. I should be an idiot," Hua Yuhao chuckled in reply. Wang Chua was taken aback. "Is there something wrong with your brain?" Hua Yuhao shook his head and said, "She was the one that said that. She told me before that I'm an idiot, and I'm her idiot. No matter what, this idiot has to be idiotic one more time. The sky is getting dark. You should leave at first light tomorrow. If you wish, you can wait for me outside the setting sun forest, and you can go back without me if I'm not out within 3 days. However, please don't tell anyone about what happened to me. Just let them believe that I've disappeared." Wang Chua's emotions erupted once more, and she began to shout at Hua Yuhao. "Idiot! You truly are an idiot, and there's nothing that can save you from your idiocy. Is it worth it? Is it really worth it?" Hua Yuhao didn't mince words as he replied decisively, "Yes, it's worth it. I have to try, no matter how much danger and peril I have to put myself through, so that Donga may continue to live. At the very least, I have to figure out the true mysteries contained within this place, and I will not give up even if there is but one sliver of hope. How can I look on with open eyes as Donga passes into the void from her hidden wound? How can I look on as my entire world turns grey? I can't let that happen." Wang Chua bit down on her lower lip. "Idiot, idiot, idiot." Hua Yuhao didn't bother with her any longer, and he collected some relatively drier branches from around him and began to make a campfire. Hua Yuhao had no qualms about starting a fire here, as there weren't many soul beasts left in this area of the setting sun forest. He was quietly observing how the faint miasma in the air reacted to his campfire at the same time. Heated rations were still tastier than cold ones. Hua Yuhao didn't dare to cook food from the things around him, as the plants and vegetation around him had been immersed in this miasma for an incredibly long time, and they probably contained toxins to some degree. He made some thick soup from the rations and food that he had brought along with him and began to eat. Wang Chua's emotions had exploded for a moment, but she swiftly returned to normal. She came over to his side and began to eat as well. Night inside the setting sun forest was a lot colder than inside the Great Stardow forest. There wasn't much wind, but the environment's eerie cold and humidity was still exceedingly uncomfortable. Fortunately, they had this campfire. The two of them sat around the campfire and sipped on their warm soup, and this helped them dispel the chill. Hua Yuhao finished the soup in his bowl and stretched out comfortably. He got to his feet and surveyed the area with spiritual detection to make sure there were no dangers or threats around them before sitting back on the ground. Wang Chua sipped her soup in small mouthfuls. She was very serious in this endeavor, as if she was holding some precious treasure in her hands. Chua, at which time of day is this miasma the thickest? When is it the thinnest? Wang Chua answered coldly, it's thickest in the morning, and it's thinnest at midday. Hua Yuhao's eyes closed into a squint. Since that's the case, it's probably because the morning is a lot more humid than the rest of the day. The accumulated moisture throughout the night probably makes it easier for this miasma to travel. Sunlight is strongest at midday, and the moisture within all this miasma will partially evaporate under direct sunlight. It will thin without the help of voluminous water vapor. Is that correct? Wang Chua nodded. That's good, then. Hua Yuhao closed his eyes, and he seemed like he was starting to meditate beside the campfire. Hey, what are you going on and on about? Wang Chua sounded a little upset. Hua Yuhao opened his eyes once more. He heaved a faint sigh and said, I'm serious, Chua. You should leave at first light tomorrow. Wang Chua grunted coldly and said, what makes you think you can tell me what to do? Do you think you are the only one that is allowed to do idiotic things? Hua Yuhao shook his head. But there's no need for that. It's too dangerous, and I am not even 10% confident in succeeding. I'll have to rely on guesswork, trial, and error for many things. Stop beating around the bush. Say it, what's your plan, exactly? Since I have already followed you this far, do you think I can just look on while you venture into danger and peril all by yourself? Who do you think I am? Wang Chua's voice was ice cold. Even though her tone was cold, her words were warmer than even the campfire before him when they fell into his ears. Helping's hands in one's direst moment were usually the most precious things one could ever have. Thank you. Hua Yuhao took a deep breath and said, if you're willing to help, then I think our chances of success will be raised to 30%. If this toxic miasma is the only threat in this place, then I have an 80% chance of escaping with my life at least. The only thing I'm worried about right now is if there are other dangers besides this toxic miasma. Wang Chua was astounded when she heard his words. Are you being blindly optimistic? Why do you think you have an 80% chance of escaping with your life? Hua Yuhao answered, perhaps I'm not as familiar with forests inhabited by soul beasts or with miasma as you are, but my judgment and decision-making skills are still quite reliable. The person that imparted this map to me is a senior, and I am positive that he harbors no malicious intent. This is the reason why he added a seal on the map when he gave it to me, so that I would only come here to find the yearning heartbroken grass to save Dornga's life when I was strong enough. I opened this seal by chance, and before I have obtained the necessary strength. However, the records suggest that not every area on the way to my destination is covered by this toxic miasma. Otherwise, I may not even have the confidence of retrieving what I'm looking for even if I were a titled Doluor. This miasma greatly hinders my spiritual detection, so how else could I find what I need to find? I trust that this task that this senior has given to me isn't that difficult to accomplish. Wang Chua grunted and said, these are but your conjectures. Hua Yuhao chortled and replied, we have to hypothesize boldly, but we have to prove it conscientiously and carefully. Furthermore, I have other safeguards. You've already said that this miasma is strongest during the early morning, and it will weaken at midday. That means there is no doubt that we should move forward at midday. Furthermore, since the warmth from sunlight impedes the miasma, why don't we create something hot so that we can weaken the miasma around us? I've been observing it using spiritual detection ever since I started the campfire, and I realized that the miasma has no way of resisting fire, and clearly vanishes around this campfire. It's apparent that flames are fatal to this miasma. I don't have any fire-type abilities, but some of the soul tools that I carry around can create some fire, and are proving extremely effective. I've already attached these soul tools to the all-terrain self-propelling fort, and I've made the fort even more airtight than before, along with some other changes that will be imperative to keeping us alive. Also, my second martial soul possesses ultimate ice. Perhaps ice won't have the same effect on the miasma as fire does, but the miasma carries minuscule toxins that will be greatly weakened under exceedingly cold temperatures. Furthermore, my ultimate ice can affect the water vapor that makes up the fog. The miasma will also be weakened without water vapor to help it permeate. I've combined all this with the prepared safeguards to keep us alive. Even if we can't venture too deep inside, we will have no problem breaking out, since all we have to do is prevent the miasma from corroding our flying-type soul tools. That being the case, we will have no problem escaping from here. The incredulity in Wang Chua's eyes grew stronger and stronger as she listened to Hua Yuhao's analysis. She was truly astonished. She had just been daydreaming beside him during this short period of time, but he had already come up with so many solutions to deal with the problem. Everything he said made perfect sense. Rational judgment told her that not everywhere within this miasma was dangerous, and they also had ice and fire to handle the problem. The danger from Wang Chua's point of view seemed to diminish. Hua Yuhao chortled as he stared at the astonished look on her face. Do you suddenly feel that I am smart and powerful? Wang Chua snapped, enough nonsense. Hurry up and rest. We'll get moving tomorrow. They began to meditate beside the campfire. The miasma was undeniably dangerous, but it also formed a protective dome around them. There were so few soul beasts in the area that they weren't threatened at all. The night passed without any other words. Hua Yuhao activated his flying-type soul tool at first light and soared into the sky to monitor the surrounding miasma. Wang Chua's words were accurate. The miasma in the morning was conspicuously denser, and he could see faint white fog around their location. However, the miasma around these parts was not that toxic, and dissipated or disintegrated when it came near the campfire. Hua Yuhao adjusted his altitude from time to time so that he could better monitor the situation, and he recorded everything that he saw. He didn't dare to be careless about anything that concerned his and Wang Chua's safety, especially anything that would have an impact on whether he could retrieve the yearning heartbroken grass or not. The sun rose fully as he continued to observe and calculate. Hua Yuhao continuously communicated his observations to Wang Chua, and they patiently waited for midday to arrive. Finally, it was almost time. Hua Yuhao and Wang Chua ate some more, had their fill of water, and set off in their peak condition. Hua Yuhao's eyes were as cold as ice as he stared at the thinning miasma in the air. The weather was good today, the sun was radiant as it loomed over the earth, and there wasn't a single cloud to be seen. Truthfully, it wasn't what Hua Yuhao had wanted most. What he wanted most was heavy rain and a thunderstorm. The miasma would be weakened to a larger extent if a heavy downpour came down upon the setting sun forest. Unfortunately, this was still the dry season, and storms were few and far between in the northern regions to begin with. The scorching sun completely dashed his hopes. We'll be setting off soon, Chua. Hua Yuhao turned towards Wang Chua. Let's go. Wang Chua's expression was equally cold and stoic, but there was a tinge of excitement beneath her eyes. This was the first time she had encountered a situation like this, where Hua Yuhao's intricate and comprehensive plan resolved the various dangers and threats. She was filled with curiosity and excitement against a natural phenomenon such as this, and the mystery of the unknown and uncertain dangers was extremely stimulating to her. Hua Yuhao extended the flying-type soul tool behind his back, and reached out for Wang Chua with his left hand. Their lives were at stake, and it was necessary to conserve as much soul power as they could with every step they took so that they could maintain themselves at their peak conditions. Their martial soul fusion would have a substantial part to play in this endeavor, and Hua Yuhao couldn't be bothered with anything lesser at a time like this. Wang Chua glanced at him and hemphed, but eventually slipped her left hand into his palm. Their hands clasped together, and their soul power naturally interacted, flourishing soul power undulations rippling out. Hua Yuhao looked up at the sky as he grabbed Wang Chua's hand, and channeled soul power into her before they both soared into the sky. They surged out of the setting sun forest and continued to climb higher and higher. Their Class 6 flying-type soul tools propelled them up, and they quickly reached several hundred meters in the sky. However, Hua Yuhao showed no signs of stopping as he continued flying upward with Wang Chua. The miasma beneath them covered a tremendous area, which Hua Yuhao had roughly gauged beforehand. The strongest part of the miasma permeated to about 300 meters above ground, and these were the parts that had hints of color. The miasma here looked exceptionally beautiful, but was also exceedingly dangerous. They climbed to about 700 meters before Hua Yuhao stabilized his altitude. They were currently high enough to avoid the miasma's toxicity, and he took another glance at it before he pulled Wang Chua along and flew towards the place where the miasma was the thickest. Never once did he consider using the all-terrain self-propelling fort to move forward on the ground toward their destination. The miasma on the ground would become increasingly thick, which meant that it would also become more corrosive. This would take a continuous toll on the fort's protective barrier and his soul power, whereas using their flying-type soul tools expended a lot less. More importantly, his spiritual detection would be greatly impeded as they went deeper into the thick miasma. This meant that it would be impossible for him to determine direction and proceed toward his destination as fast as he could. It was different in the sky. Discerning direction in the air was convenient, and he was almost sure that the place where the miasma was the densest was likely where he had to go. The place where exotic things existed were undoubtedly unique, and this toxic miasma could be considered one of this place's unique features. Even if using flying-type soul tools consumed more soul power than moving along the ground with his all-terrain self-propelling fort, Hua Yuhao would still choose the sky because it was a lot faster, and they could reach the skies above their destination in no time. Hua Yuhao's subsequent plan could be executed as fast as possible, and this meant he would be conserving soul power. The area they were coming from was in the toxic miasma's outer regions. They were flying as fast as they could through the sky, and it took but a few minutes before they reached the sky above the area where the miasma was most dense. Hua Yuhao held on to Wang Chua with his right hand as he raised his left hand into the air. A beam of light sparkled from his ring, and a stationary soul cannon about 1.5 meters long appeared in his hands. He held the cannon stably on his shoulder, and let go of Wang Chua's hand for a moment. He swung his wrist, and the storage ring on his left hand immediately produced 2 stationary soul cannon shells in his hands. These were the cannon shells with red markings that he had picked out the previous day. Hua Yuhao placed one shell into the barrel and held onto the other one as he activated spiritual detection. He was looking down from the sky, and the area he could cover was naturally greater than usual, while there was nothing obstructing his vision. Wang Chua controlled her flying-type soul tool and flew behind him while she tilted herself backward, so that she wouldn't affect his flying-type soul tool stability as she grabbed his shoulders with both hands at the same time. Their martial souls began to fuse, greatly boosting Hua Yuhao's soul power. Hua Yuhao didn't pause at all, swinging his right hand and tossing the cannon shell in it down. It fell away rapidly, while he quickly supported the stationary soul cannon with his right hand and locked onto the shell with his spiritual detection. Just as T-cannon shell was about to pierce through the thick miasma, Hua Yuhao fired his soul cannon. Boom! The tremendous recoil pushed Hua Yuhao several meters through the air as a brilliant red beam erupted from his soul cannon. The cannon shell barreled forward at devastating speed, and went straight for the other cannon shell that Hua Yuhao had tossed out earlier. The shell fired by the stationary soul cannon naturally flew a lot faster than the one that was in freefall through the air. Hua Yuhao had used spiritual detection to lock onto his target, and his accuracy was comparable to ruler measurements. A red streak of light unerringly struck the cannon shell that had just plunged into the thick miasma. Boom, boom, boom. A series of explosions could be heard, and the thick miasma was immediately tainted fiery red. The entire miasmic cloud began to tremble violently and tumultuously as sparks flew in all directions. The stationary cannon shell that Hua Yuhao had used was a Class 5 explosive incendiary bomb. It wasn't as powerful as the giant lightning cannon that he had used before, but it had an extremely large area of effect. The explosion would also generate a terrifying amount of intense heat, whose waves would permeate in all directions. A single Class 5 explosive incendiary bomb could cover a radius of at least 100 meters, and was exceptionally violent. Hua Yuhao opted to use 2 shells, and made it so that these 2 shells would collide and detonate in the air for an even more explosive impact, which would cause even more damage to the miasmic cloud. On the other hand, detonating the cannon shell on the ground might damage the herb that he was supposed to retrieve. He wanted to obliterate the miasma, not this magical herb. His calculations could be said to be impeccable and precise, and he executed his plan as perfectly as could be. Hua Yuhao didn't conserve his stationary soul cannon shells, and fired another 2 more, one after another without hesitation. More frightening explosions rippled through the air. The first explosion had already cleared away a large amount of the toxic clouds, and the second explosion detonated at a position slightly below the first one. Their vision immediately became clearer when the second explosion went off. Let's go. Hua Yuhao swiftly stored his stationary soul cannon before reaching back with his right hand and grabbing Wang Chua's arm, and they plunged towards the ground. The stationary soul cannon had opened a path, but it couldn't be maintained for too long. Once the high temperature dissipated, the thick miasma in the surroundings would immediately start to condense once more. 4 Class 5 stationary soul cannon shells had opened this path, and Hua Yuhao couldn't waste such a great opportunity. Their bodies plummeted rapidly, and they quickly dove toward the thick miasma. Hua Yuhao and Wang Chua could clearly see that the surrounding miasma was starting to close up at an alarming speed. The miasma was just too thick and dense, to the point where it seemed to materialize in the sky as it collapsed in on the hole. The vegetation beneath them was conspicuously different from the plants in the setting sun forest's outer regions. Many of these plants were dotted with colors, but this spectacle didn't represent anything good at all. Colorful plants often meant acute venom. This was common knowledge they had learned at Shrek Academy. Hua Yuhao was extremely calm at this moment. He pushed his spiritual detection to its largest possible range and meticulously monitored everything that was happening around him. It was clear that there was no way out once he and Wang Chua submerged themselves in the toxic cloud, and they could only move forward. They only had this one chance. If they backed out, they would no longer have the ability to delve into this mysterious miasmic world a second time. They barreled through several hundred meters in the blink of an eye. They were just about to hit the ground when Wang Chua went ahead and punched downward. Golden light erupted amidst a deep dragon roar as fearsome strength compressed the air around them until it began to crackle shrilly. Wang Chua created a deep crater in the ground as explosions continued to ring out, and the colorful plants on the ground, and the liquids within them, were sent flying in all directions. They landed stably on the ground, and Hua Yuhao activated his Class 6 protective soul barrier immediately, enveloping them both, and swiftly began to survey his surroundings. The world around them was so colorful that everything felt like rainbows. The multicolored plants on the ground covered every single piece of ground, and not a single inch of soil could be seen. There were hardly any trees or woods in this area, which was probably because of the corrosive power of the plant's toxins. Wang Chua was a little surprised as she observed, strange, the miasma on the ground isn't as dense as it is in the sky. This was true. They were in the miasma's core regions, and the miasmic clouds here were tinged with the colors of the rainbow. However, it was only present as a faint mist here, and even though it hindered their vision to a certain extent, it wasn't enough to block their line of sight completely. The miasma was undoubtedly a lot thinner than the thick and toxic clouds in the sky above them. Huo Yuhao explained, clouds and mist always permeate and drift away upward. I already noticed this, as even though the miasma is dense in these parts, it's obvious that it's drifting upward, so the miasma on the ground probably isn't as toxic as it is above us. However, these multicolored miasmic clouds are still extremely dangerous. I can already feel the miasma corroding my protective barrier, even though it's energy-based. Huo Yuhao had already determined the right direction when they were in the sky. He pulled Wang Chua and immediately proceeded towards their destination. They were very careful as they pushed forward. Cold energy condensed beneath Huo Yuhao's feet, and a layer of frost appeared on the ground with every step that he took so that he could block off the plants they were walking on. The soul protective barrier could clear away the plants in front of them, but it couldn't do anything against the plants beneath their feet, so Huo Yuhao had to resort to this clumsy method. There was no doubt that this consumed soul power, but it was safer than otherwise. He was not about to let himself come into contact with any of these venomous plants or the multicolored miasma, as he had no idea how toxic these things could be. It would be almost impossible to retreat if something happened to him right here, or if a hole opened in his protective barrier. They began to see some things that made their skin crawl as they pushed forward. Enormous bones and skeletons would appear on the ground from time to time, and those bones were also as multicolored the miasma around them. Clearly, these weren't plants, but the remains of soul beasts that had perished from the poison. Crack! A sound could be heard from not too far away, which startled them both. They concentrated their soul power at almost the same time as they gazed in the direction the sound came from. A large skeleton began to lean sideways. The bones beneath it had clearly become fragile and brittle from the corrosion, and the skeleton crashed to the ground with a loud boom in the next moment, exploding into a million broken pieces. The brilliant colors above them became even denser than before. Huo Yuhao and Wang Chua both drew cold breaths as they looked on. They could see that the venom was so toxic that it could corrode bones, to the point where these bones became fragile, and eventually disintegrated. It was not hard to imagine the number of soul beasts that were buried underneath these multicolored plants. A soul beast skeleton was the toughest part of its body, and some were even used by humans as special materials. One of the items that best represented this was undoubtedly the golden dragon spear in Wang Chua's hands. It felt as if everything in this miasmic world was being corroded. This toxic cloud was just too overwhelmingly poisonous, Wang Chua muttered. These remains have become nutrients for the toxic miasma. The miasma continuously murders other living beings, and even the birds flying through the skies above have become victims. This cycle has made the miasma stronger and stronger. Perhaps, after millennia, the entire setting sun forest will become a toxic and miasmic forest. That's just too horrifying. Huo Yuhao's eyebrows were tightly knit together as he began to pick up the pace. He had realized that the colors outside his soul protective barrier were becoming denser as the multicolored miasma began to stick to his barrier. He could withdraw his protective barrier to shake off the toxic miasma, but that would mean he and Wang Chua would be exposed to it. The toxic miasma was exceedingly corrosive, and Huo Yuhao could clearly feel that his soul power was being consumed at an alarming speed. This was definitely not something that he wanted to see, so he had no choice but to push forward more quickly than before. When they reached a point where both he and Wang Chua couldn't take it anymore, he would use an explosive incendiary bomb to open a path like before, and they would then use their flying-type soul tools to escape from this toxic world. It was the only way to stay alive. The world around them was full of brilliant colors as they continued forward. The map wasn't useful anymore at this point. Huo Yuhao could still use the map to roughly determine their location before they came in, but he could only rely on luck and continual spiritual detection to find his destination once they were inside. Huo Yuhao would activate spiritual detection to sweep in a single direction every few minutes. This method was a little clumsy, but it was still effective. In addition to his exemplary memory, it made sure they were not walking around in circles. An hour quickly passed. Huo Yuhao had already expended his first milk bottle. However, Wang Chua was the one that actually used the milk bottle, as he had to focus his energy on his spiritual detection. Their soul power was connected, so replenishing Wang Chua's soul power meant Huo Yuhao was also replenishing his own. Huo Yuhao began to narrow down his destination after the hour of exploration. However, the miasmic clouds outside were starting to put more and more pressure on him, to the point where the multicolored miasma completely blocked off his vision outside the protective barrier. He also had to strengthen his protective barrier continuously to maintain its integrity. Wait, Huo Yuhao whispered as he immediately pulled on Wang Chua. She was already in his embrace before she could even react. Wang Chua was still carefully perceiving everything around her, and this sudden change startled her. A dense masculine aura smacked her in the face, and she even felt a little dizzy, as if she had been struck by the toxic miasma outside. An incredibly cold aura emanated from Hua Yuhao's body in the next moment, and this aura crossed over Wang Chua's body and permeated outside. "I've done it." Hua Yuhao's delighted voice could be heard, and Wang Chua was shocked awake as Hua Yuhao released her from his embrace at the same time. Wang Chua turned to look, and saw that the multicolored radiance had been replaced by icy blue colors in a 5-meter radius around them. Voluminous rainbow-colored particles had been blown into the air, and the dense miasmic particles that were originally plastered on the soul protective barrier vanished at the same time. This is the domain of perpetual ice. Hua Yuhao had used his domain of perpetual ice to freeze the water vapor within the toxic miasma, and he controlled these frozen particles to push outward so that his barrier was a little cleaner. This method was a little dubious, and it felt as if he was drinking poison to quench his thirst. In the end, the domain of perpetual ice consumed a lot of soul power, and Hua Yuhao wouldn't have decided on this method if not for the fact that his protective barrier was reaching the end of its life. Hua Yuhao withdrew his barrier at this moment and released it against immediately afterwards. His soul power consumption was instantly restored to the optimal level. Hua Yuhao also took this opportunity to take a breather. Wang Chua forcibly suppressed her palpitating heartbeat as she suggested calmly, "Why don't you use your third eye to probe around? We may consume a lot more soul power if we continue going around in circles." She didn't need Hua Yuhao's explanation to understand that the embrace happened because he didn't want her to get hurt because of his soul skill. Bringing their bodies into close contact meant that Hua Yuhao could use their martial soul fusion to unleash his soul skill beyond her body, and it was clearly the best choice at the moment. But this guy still hugged me in the end. The truth was that Hua Yuhao also had butterflies in his stomach. Wang Chua's body was a lot softer and more tender than he had imagined. Of course, that tenderness only lasted for a second before it became rock hard. He was afraid that Wang Chua would suddenly erupt, but her calm words made him extremely relieved. What an intelligent girl. Hua Yuhao was full of awe and admiration inside. Hua Yuhao nodded and closed his eyes, and golden light flickered on his forehead as he slowly opened his eye of destiny. He stopped moving forward and remained where he was. The extreme chill brought about by his domain of perpetual ice could be maintained for quite a while, and that slowed down the toxic miasma's assault. His initial judgment was correct. Ice and fire were exceedingly damaging and controlling towards the miasmic clouds. It was a pity that he was far from strong enough. If he had been a titled Doluor, he could possibly channel his domain of perpetual ice with all his might to create an enormous blizzard and actually obliterate some of this miasma. If he kept sweeping across this area for a prolonged period of time, he wouldn't need very long to clean out all the miasma in this area. If he could find the origin of all this large naturally occurring disastrous land would no longer consume life. Faint light continued to flicker as Hua Yuhao's face flowed with a subtle chill. The eye of destiny on his forehead glowed with golden light, and his martial soul fusion with Wang Chua boosted his eye of destiny's power exponentially. His martial soul fusion with Wang Donga also gave him an all-around boost, but Wang Chua gave him an explosive amplification, and this was mainly presented in his strength and his spiritual power. This boost was extremely pure, just like their martial soul fusion. Hua Yuhao's martial soul fusion with Wang Donga could be considered a general boost, while his martial soul fusion with Wang Chua could be considered a specific boost. The amplification direction was different, so each had their own effects. At this moment, Wang Chua's explosive effects were more effective for this attempt at stretching the limits of his spiritual detection. Hua Yuhao channeled his eye of destiny with all his might, and a powerful golden beam of light fired out from his vertical eye. This golden beam was deep and profound, and even Wang Chua didn't dare to stare directly at his brilliant golden eye. Scenes flashed by in Hua Yuhao's spiritual detection, and his head also began to swivel as he searched his surroundings. Even Hua Yuhao himself was astonished by the distance he could reach with spiritual detection. He realized, to his surprise, that he could reach far past his normal limit of 5 kilometers. His soul power was consumed at an alarming rate, but the vast distance that he could reach undoubtedly saved him a lot of time. This amplification is so powerful, it feels even stronger than it was inside the Great Stardo Forest. This thought crossed Hua Yuhao's mind, and his eyes grew slack in the next moment. The golden light disappeared, and his vertical eye closed up before it vanished with another flicker of golden light. "How is it?" Wang Chua asked softly, and she seemed a little fatigued as well. In the end, Hua Yuhao wasn't the only one expending spiritual power. Hua Yuhao's eyes sparkled as he replied, "I think I have found the direction leading to our target. The miasma over there is different. I think it's more toxic, and I can see that the miasmic clouds beyond that patch are conspicuously lower than before. It's likely to be the valley that we're looking for. Let's go, quickly." He grasped Wang Chua's hand as he spoke and raced in the direction he had just identified. They were naturally moving a lot faster than before now that they had a proper target. Hua Yuhao didn't conserve any soul power, and raised his protective barrier to the highest possible level to keep all the miasma outside as they pushed forward as fast as they could. His spiritual detection had reached more than 7 kilometers, and his target was right at the end of that range. This place was filled with deadly venom, but Hua Yuhao and Wang Chua only needed 15 minutes to rush 7 kilometers. The second milk bottle was already in Wang Chua's hands, and a different world from before swiftly appeared in the distance in front of them. Everything was bluish-green, and just so astounding and eerie. Cyan hues blanketed the earth, while the plants that grew around them covered large patches of earth in a seemingly messy and disorganized manner of teals, aquas, and turquoises. Faint blue-green mist floated up from them before gradually beginning to expand outwards. What kind of plant is that? Hua Yuhao didn't dare to venture forward blindly, and he halted in his tracks as astonishment flowed from his eyes. These blue-green plants extended to either side of them. They weren't that tall, about half a meter tall, and every single plant had 9 strangely shaped leaves. These leaves resembled human hands, but each one had 7 fingers, while some of the relatively larger ones had 9 fingers. There were enormous cyan flowers located at the tips of every leaf, and the mists were being released from the large flower stamens. The mist gradually expanded in all directions before flowing into the multicolored miasma. The cyan hues they let off were a substantial part of the multicolored miasma. Hua Yuhao gazed far into the distance, and could see with his formidable vision that huge patches of miasmic clouds were gathered behind these bluish-green plants. These miasmic clouds were gradually flowing towards the ground, but their densities were comparable to what they had encountered in the sky before this. It was no wonder he couldn't see this when he was still in the sky, as the densest miasmic clouds were sinking down in this area. There was no question that the place the miasmic clouds were sinking into was a mountain valley. Wang Chua stared at the bluish-green plants before them, as if she were trying to distinguish something. Hua Yuhao quickly retrieved a bright silvery piece of metal from his storage ring and threw it towards the blue-green plants in the distance. It was a piece of platinum, a metal which had a very high resistance to corrosion. The platinum piece hurtled through the multicolored miasma and quickly became tainted with various colors. However, astounding and terrifying transformations began to happen to it when it reached the space above the bluish-green mists in the sky. The platinum began to emanate dense streams of green mist when it came into contact with the toxic green clouds, and then its volume began to diminish at breakneck speed. Half of the platinum had disappeared by the time it hit the ground, and it only took about 3 breaths before that tough and corrosion-resistant metal vanished into thin air. This corrosion is so strong. Hua Yuhao drew a cold breath. He felt as if his legs were filled with lead, and he didn't dare to take another step forward. He could tell from how the platinum was corroded that this acidic mist was not something that his Class 6 protective barrier could defend against. Could he fly past it from above? However, the cyan mist reached an incredible height, and looked like it formed a dome that loomed over the valley. What exactly is this? How can it be so horrifyingly toxic and acidic? Hua Yuhao retrieved a soul tool as thoughts spun around in his head, and fired a soul ray at the green mist in the distance. A red beam of light surged forward and left a fiery radiance behind in the air. This was a soul flame ray, and even though it was just a Class 3 soul tool, it was extremely effective at burning things up. The rainbow-colored miasma surged and dissipated when it came into contact with the flame. However, once this flame ray reached the green mists beyond, the multicolored miasma had a lot more green inside, and it became conspicuously more resistant to the flames. When the flames reached the green mists, the scene that Hua Yuhao absolutely didn't want to see occurred. The toxic green clouds suddenly became a lot stronger than before after the flames incinerated it. The green clouds all around them surged with lightning speed as they poured back along the cleared path burned by the flame, right towards where Hua Yuhao and Wang Chua were standing. Run. Hua Yuhao dragged Wang Chua as he turned around to run without hesitation. He knew very well that he couldn't let a single ounce of that green mist touch his body, or they would both remain here as fertilizer. They turned and ran in the opposite direction. Hua Yuhao brought out the stationary soul cannon from before as he ran, and the green toxic mist chased them down from behind as if it had a life of its own. The bluish-green mist was moving even faster than their running speed, and he didn't dare to hesitate or delay for even a single second. He fired twice, and the poisonous clouds in the air exploded to open up a path for them. Hua Yuhao grabbed Wang Chua as they soared into the sky, while he unleashed his domain of perpetual ice to its highest defensive capability as he pulled her into his embrace. He activated his flying-type soul tool, and the 4 soul thrusters behind his back erupted at the same time, raising his speed to the highest possible level and driving him through the air. The green clouds loomed behind them, but Hua Yuhao and Wang Chua soared through the hole within the poisonous clouds in the air that they had just opened up before the green clouds could reach them. Hua Yuhao flew 800 meters into the sky in one go before he dared to slow down. His forehead had already broken out in a cold sweat. Wang Chua hadn't done anything at all. Besides completing his martial soul fusion for him, she was just following him around. Hua Yuhao hugged her for a longer duration than before this time, and there seemed to be an extra something in Wang Chua's otherwise calm expression that's too frightening. The green toxic mist isn't afraid of fire, and it can even retaliate. Hua Yuhao released Wang Chua from his embrace, and only then did he realize that the girl hadn't even opened her flying-type soul tool. Her pretty eyes seemed like they were deep in thought. Hey, open your flying-type soul tool. My soul power has been consumed until there's almost nothing left, Hua Yuhao hurriedly reminded her. Oh. Wang Chua acknowledged as she infused soul power into the flying-type soul tool behind her, and she worked together with Hua Yuhao to stabilize herself in midair. Hua Yuhao glanced downwards. What he saw was a torrential green mushroom cloud, which had surged 500 meters into the air before it gradually receded. The multicolored miasmic clouds were assimilated once they came into contact with this green cloud, as if the miasmic clouds for several kilometers around them had been riled up with this explosion. It felt as if the toxic clouds had been infuriated. Why do I feel like these poisonous clouds have a life of their own? I am absolutely certain that my target is located in the valley behind those poisonous green clouds. Hua Yuhao's eyebrows were tightly knit together. Wang Chua suddenly lowered her voice and said, I remember now. I know what those green plants are. This video will end here. Thank you for watching.